Now, I've titled this, What Belongs in a Public Art Collection? And this may seem to you to be an incredibly silly question, so absolutely self-evident that it doesn't need tackling at all. But in fact, if you look at the history of public collections, what emerges is a fascinating history of changes in attitudes about what belongs in the various of public museums that only really started in the 18th century. And art collections are very much part of this ongoing long historical discourse about what belongs in that particular kind of collection. What classifies something as belonging to an art collection as opposed to, for example, a collection of manufactured objects, or, to take it even further, a history collection or a natural history collection. I mean, these divisions, although we're really not aware of it from day to day, are constantly in subtle ways being negotiated and slightly altered. And so what I'm going to look at today, by way of a very brief little contextual discussion, is how the art gallery here has over the years broadened its conception of what belongs within its walls. If we go back to the pre-public collection era, when collecting was done by private individuals, one of the typical kind of collections that you find is something that's been dubbed a curiosity cabinet, in which a whole paraphernalia of things was collected by eager, inquisitive collectors. Now, these collections typically included pictures, as this one does here, but the pictures were collected in a great jumble along with natural objects, shells we see in profusion here, and other manufactured objects, so man-made objects plus natural objects. And the man-made objects included coins, they included locks, they included little books, they included little containers of some sort, such as we see here, if I can find my little flicker. And they also contained those manufactured objects that we now call art. Now, what hadn't happened at this stage was the modern certainty about this sort of thing being different from this sort of thing, or this sort of thing, or this sort of thing. What hadn't happened was the modern distinction between objects of art, or fine art, as we sometimes call it, and objects of craft or design, terms that we sometimes use interchangeably. The term craft is often that thing that is handmade in small quantities. The object of design often refers to the modern object that is made in mass quantities and very often by a machine. But really, objects of craft and design are both man-made things, human-made things, that we now feel differ in some significant way from the objects that we call art. And what firmed up in the course of the 18th century, when philosophers became very interested in the question of what is special about art, what firmed up was an idea that artworks have a special kind of effect on us, and that they do so by virtue of the fact that they have no function. So what started to firm up in the 18th century was a basic distinction between manufactured objects which had a function primarily, but which also might be decorative and pleasing to the eye, and those manufactured objects which were made with no function at all in mind except to be looked at. And that second category of objects came to be called the objects of fine art. And we can loosely describe them as paintings, works of sculpture, such as we see here, prints that have been made with no functional aim in mind, and drawings made with the same aim. And of course there are some prints and drawings and paintings that are made for functional purposes, but those that weren't were now deemed to be art. And it was that group of objects which formed the nucleus of the public art collections which were starting in the 18th century. Now that has had a very long history. The idea that an art collection should contain those things, but that the other things don't belong. There's no place in an art collection for coins. There's no place in an art collection for cleverly made locks or other items of what we might call daily furniture. That's had a long history. But all the time, too, we find chipping away at the edges the idea that, well, maybe we can bring this one in. Maybe we can perhaps call this art. And that's the intriguing story of our own gallery, too. So just to play a little game for a moment with ideas of what is and what isn't art. Intriguing questions such as, why is it that a very finely made chair by William Morris, a very serious craftsman and designer, is regarded as a piece of furniture first and foremost and doesn't appear in an art gallery, whereas a picture of a chair by the beautiful Danish 19th century, early 20th century painter Hammershøi is immediately something different for us. What is the difference? The first one is primarily functional and is nevertheless, through its careful design, meant to please the eye. The other has no other purpose but to be looked at. What's the point of it? What's the point of it? Well, for aesthetic theorists of the 18th century, the point of it was that it transported us into another world. It took us beyond the world of ordinary chairs and whether they were good to sit on. That was precisely not the point of looking at a painting of a chair. In looking at a painting of a chair, you thought instead about transcendent beauty. You thought about things that went beyond the world of functionality. So this concept of function is all the time dividing the two. Let's take another example. A rug designed by the Omega workshops by very serious designers who functioned in the early 20th century in the London area. What is the difference between this, which ends up on the floor of a home being trampled on, and an abstractionist work by, for example, Frank Stella, which for a vast amount of money hangs on a wall to be merely gazed at? Pictorially, there's not a great difference. But we operate all the time with these very clear ideas about classificatory boundaries. One is art, the other isn't. Well, what is the other? The other is a craft, or we could say an object of design, whichever of those two words we want to use. Let's take another example, and here we're getting into really interesting territory with the concept of illustration. Illustrations are illustrations of something else. They are doing a job to illustrate something else. They are functional. And how strange it is that fabulous illustrators who worked sometimes for the children's book industry, I take the example of Edward Ardisoni, who was a fine art trained student, scarcely get a mention in the books that they appear in. The writer is mentioned, the illustrator in smaller print below. And the case of botanical illustration, which has some very fine draftsmen in its midst. I take the famous Redoute from the 18th century as an example, which is seen as a functional kind of drawing, which scarcely features in the conventional art gallery. We don't typically find collections of botanical drawings or book illustrations in a gallery, but we find drawings that were drawn only to be looked at and to exist as autonomous separate things. So this is an interesting question that was pondered in the 19th century and which some people felt was a false distinction. And one of the famous people who really wanted to bring back together the idea of the art object, a manufactured object after all, and the craft or the design object, and re-examine them, re-exhibit and collect them together, was Henry Cole. Henry Cole was the organizer of the famous Great Exhibition of 1851, sometimes dubbed the Crystal Palace. And this was a temporary exhibition visited by thousands of people, an exhibition of manufactured goods and also of some sculpture too, which was exhibited largely in order to show off the technical finesse of the sculptors of the work. But Henry Cole's whole idea was that a permanent museum should be created out of this great exhibition. And it should be a museum which didn't make this, what he felt was a false distinction between art and craft or design. This was to become the Victoria and Albert Museum. And from many of the exhibits of the Great Exhibition, Cole selected a number of things which he put into this new permanent exhibition space, this new permanent museum, which started in the late 19th century. And to this day, the Victoria and Albert Museum is a fine example of a great eclecticism of collecting, so that it has fashion, it has paintings too, it has furniture also, it has jewellery, it has ceramic ware, all of it regarded with an equalising eye, if you like. Now at the Victoria and Albert, those displays of items are largely in separate rooms, but there's another thing that you could do, and that was tried out a lot in the early 20th century, and that is to, within one room, integrate objects that have been, all objects that have been manufactured by hand, but some that we call art and some that we call furniture. And this is something that you see in many of those private homes with art collections that have been turned over to the public. Isabella Stewart Gardner's museum in Boston, opened in the early years of the 20th century, is a nice example of this. Deliberately, they decided to try to retain the feeling of a domestic space with furniture, very beautiful furniture, very carefully designed and manufactured furniture, shown in an equalizing kind of spirit with the very fine paintings on the walls. Now, the paintings were called art, the furniture was called furniture. But in displays of this kind, we are encouraged to try to see all of these as equally remarkable, handmade, man-made things. But there was a backlash against this, with the rise of modernist feeling and the kind of feelings that art should remain pure of life that started to swell up in the 1920s and 30s. You find voices within the museum world saying, no, get rid of the furniture, get rid of the bits and pieces of decorative stuff. And a fine example of this comes from Kenneth Clark, the famous director of the National Gallery in the 1930s. Look at this quote. If you put a work of art in a very decorative room, he says witheringly, and you hang it with objects of decoration, you reduce it to their level. There's an assumption that one is higher than the other. The pictures of the Italian Renaissance, which used to be treated in this way, always gave me the impression that they were not the originals, but clever reproductions, such as one might find in an upholsterer's shop. There are just so many withering put-downs in this comment, and they're all to do with the need to reassert the hierarchical separation of art from craft and design. And indeed, in Kenneth Clark's period of directorship of the gallery, and throughout most of the big European galleries, and a little later at our own gallery too, that concept of the white-walled, cleared, empty space gallery became the dominant model. It's often been called the white cube model, because the idea was that the walls shouldn't be colourful, there should be no distracting decoration, distracting from the most important thing there, which was the art. And we all knew which the art was. It was the paintings on the walls. Right, so how did this affect our own gallery? And in the early years, before the new building had been built, Florence Phillips, who was on the board of trustees, and she was a very important figure in the formation of the Johannesburg Art Gallery, which had just opened in 1910, and she'd made the same plea in the case of that too, said, is there going to be included in the gallery a museum of industrial art? This is the Henry Cole Victoria and Albert Museum idea. The side which embraces, here we go, furniture, textiles and pottery, and brings in all the art of the craftsman, the art of the craftsman. It was a very enlightened question, and the answer was no, there isn't going to be. Florence Phillips had tried, as I said, to do the same for the Johannesburg Art Gallery, and in that case too, even though she was a very powerful figure in the formation of that gallery, other forces had argued against there being an idea of this as a gallery of art and design, art and craft and design. And so both of the galleries in their early years focused heavily on the fine arts, the painting, the collecting of painting, sculpture, prints and drawings, all of them made for no functional purpose other than to be looked at. This was art and nothing else belonged. A change came, as in so many areas, with the post-war period and the arrival of that first professional director, full-time director that I told you about yesterday, John Paris. And from the moment that he came along, John Paris had the idea of broadening the museum's collection, the gallery's collection. I'm using those two words interchangeably, by the way. And it's very interesting, I think, that he introduced the idea of illustrating the annual reports, which had been going since the beginning of the gallery's life. And the first illustrated cover features these little old pieces of woven fabric, Coptic fabrics from the 6th century that had recently been given to the gallery. Now, this might have seemed like a sort of arbitrary choice, but I think it was far from arbitrary. It was a very interesting tacit message on John Paris's part that this was a collection that was to explore more than merely art. Well, that was his aim. And what he also wanted to do, and announced this right from the outset, was to start up a department of prehistoric and indigenous art, as he called it. What he meant by that was the vast, rich wealth of African artifacts and artifacts from elsewhere that hadn't traditionally been considered as part of the European fine art nexus. He wanted to put these new kinds of objects into the atrium. You'll know where the atrium is, but at that time, when he first arrived, the atrium was filled with some classical statuary, copies of classical statuary, we're back to the world of copies, which had been there for years and years. They'd been donated in 1906 to the gallery, and which John Paris felt just represented a completely worn-out aesthetic and an old history. He cleared those away, and he hoped that the atrium could now be filled with this work from this new department that he envisaged. Now, his new department never took shape, and a large part of this is to do with the dire funding situation of the gallery in those years. As I mentioned yesterday, throughout the 40s and 50s, the gallery had simply pennies only to purchase artworks with. In the 1960s, suddenly, its funding went up enormously. But by that time, John Paris had been removed. So what he did, however, was in temporary exhibitions to acknowledge this rather broader conception of what belongs in an art collection. And one of these was the Meaning of Sculpture exhibition of 1952, from which I show you just one of the installation areas in room 1. And just by the way, just notice top right-hand side of that, you'll see that the decorations that were put there in the very early years by John Wheatley and his wife are still there at this stage. They were to be removed a little later. But otherwise, the walls have been painted white. But here we have an interesting eclectic collection of African artifacts and Renaissance bronzes, along with other things, including some Henry Moore sculptures, which were put into the atrium, lent by the British Council. A lot of this work was lent. Some of the African artifacts he was borrowing from the South African Museum, which the gallery had quite recently moved from, of course. But this idea of sculpture, including, of course, African artifacts, is something that was new to the gallery at that time, and it signals this new modern awareness of a broader conception of what belongs. And this was to increase enormously in the following decade. when money now was available in really significant quantities for the first time. The gallery was really quite well able to purchase abundantly in the 1960s. By the 1970s, it was starting to complain that it needed more. But in the 1960s and into the early 70s, as I've said, a whole range of historical and contemporary African artifacts were purchased by the gallery. And largely, as I said yesterday, we've got the interests of the assistant director, Bruce Arnott, to thank for this. He'd become the assistant director by 1970, and he had done a postgraduate degree which looked into African sculpture. And as part of his buying trips for the gallery, he was going up to Johannesburg and buying works from other parts of Africa, from dealers there. Works in a range of media, bone, wood, metal. And in the period of time that Bruce Arnott was at the gallery before he moved on to the Michaelis School of Fine Art, which he did in the course of the 70s, he was putting on a range of very interesting exhibitions to do with African art, as it was now being called. The African Art and Metal exhibition was perhaps the biggest of these, of 1970. These were very, very new kinds of exhibitions, now tacitly acknowledging that maybe this kind of artifact belongs along with high European art in an art gallery. One of the other expansions of this period of time was in photography, although the work I show you here, just because it's the work that I have available from the gallery's collection, is part of a series that was bought quite a bit later in 1984. But the first photographs were given to the gallery in the 1960s, and that was another kind of interesting category expansion, because art collections had long wrestled with the idea of whether photography could be deemed a serious kind of art form to be included in this rather tight group that had long existed unquestioned: painting, sculpture, prints and drawings. Increasingly, galleries around the world were starting to collect photographs, and they were even going so far as to open up dedicated departments of photography. At the gallery, the department opened in 1970, but even by 1975, it was still talking timidly of it having a small but growing collection of photographs as autonomous works of art, as if that needed to be explained. I'm sorry about the lack of the bracket at the end. As autonomous works of art, isn't this a strange idea? Photographs that aren't merely documentary and functional, but that you're meant simply to gaze at. And it's interesting, too, in relation to this point, that at Michaelis School of Art in the 1970s, photography enters the curriculum in a big way too, heavily promoted by its new director, Neville Dubois, who made photography one of his central interests. So this was the era, if you like, of photography entering that gallery. Increasingly in more recent times, other categories of manufactured object having primarily a functional purpose have entered the gallery. And what started to be collected abundantly from the late 80s and into the 90s was beadwork from Natal, KwaZulu-Natal, beadwork from the Eastern Cape. And here again, of course, we have, if we're to sort of reduce it down to its basic level, we have pieces of costume and pieces of jewellery. These things are intended to be worn. They're intended, of course, to be decorative and pleasing to the eye, but their first function is to be worn. And so for that reason, they've got to work. You've got to make sure the clasp fits. You've got to make sure that the shape fits round the body that it's designed to fit onto. And these are questions, functional questions, that the fine artist doesn't have to deal with at all. In fact, the fine artist can be as whimsical and impractical as he or she likes. Perhaps the more whimsical and impractical, the better. That makes it more and more other than the world of functionality and ordinary day-to-day concerns. But where an object has to do a job, that priority has to come first. So here we are again in the territory of craft or objects of design. I think we could call these craft objects, since they're generally made as one-offs and handmade. And other things were added too, such as basketware. Now it's interesting that this kind of work, this kind of craft work, although it's become sort of almost politically correct to call it craft because of this ridiculous assumption that only art matters. Far better, in my view, to say that art and craft and design all matter, and let's be clear about which is which. You know, there's nothing wrong with being serious about having a functional purpose. But this kind of work, basketwork, beadwork, was one of the staples of the Bantu Education Act's notion of black art education. That's a bit of a mouthful. But in the 1950s, as you'll know, the Bantu Education Act prescribed what the curriculum of black school children should be. And they had something, a class which they termed very interestingly handwork. Whilst the white children had classes called art. The white children were learning to draw and paint. The black children were being taught to do crafts. Crafts thought to be traditional crafts. And sometimes there was an element of slightly fake nostalgia about this. Oh, black people in South Africa have always been wonderful at basketware and ceramics. Let's teach them that, preserve these old traditions. And so basketware, ceramicware, the making of pots, and work in wood and with bone, those became the basics of the Bantu Education's handwork classes. And so these were some of the new types of object, actually craft objects, that started to be bought now in the 80s and the 90s, when the gallery was realizing that it needed to represent the creative output of the whole nation. The government was pressuring it to do this too, and that in order to represent the creative output of the whole nation, it had to go beyond that narrow concept of simply fine art. Black children hadn't learned to paint and draw, at least only very, very minimally. And as I mentioned yesterday, there were very few black schools. In fact, there were none really, permanent, full-time black education schools until the 1960s. Another of the areas that the gallery started to purchase in was wooden sculpture. And this is a rather lovely example of it, purchased in 1988. And very interestingly, in the 1980s, South African art historians coined this term transitional sculpture to describe artifacts like this, because it was a kind of thing that had been produced by a man. I don't want to use the word artist now because I don't want to get into thinking that everybody's got to be called an artist. A maker, a manufacturer, Masongani, who had trained with his father, who had been a traditional wood carver, making wooden implements and objects, drinking vessels and the like, and also medicine holders for a rural market. So the son learnt this trade, and then he was discovered by white people from the urban art market, and they bought some of his work, and he developed it, he evolved it. He started to paint it in bright colours, and he evolved it to become a purely non-functional item. Originally, these little figurines had a head that you could remove. So the top of the thing was the head of the vessel, and you removed it, and inside was the medicine. Now that disappears when these works are made for an urban art market instead. He paints them brightly, and he makes them in the likeness of famous political figures. So what's happened is that an object from the craft world, unself-conscious, made for a particular functional trade market moves into the art world and with little slight changes suddenly changes its nature. And that's what happened to to Maswanganyi's work, which then increased enormously in value and was suddenly exhibited in an art gallery, a very different kind of thing. So the gallery starts to show this kind of expanded notion of its collection in a range of very thought-provoking, stimulating exhibitions in the course of the 1990s. Marilyn Martin is now the director, and she really revolutionizes the gallery and makes it internationally well known, and does so by this very deliberate policy, partly as a result of government pressure, of having broadened her conception of what belongs. So we have exhibitions of the vast amount of beadwork that's now in the gallery collections, and we see that in connection too with models which show how it's worn, and also with wall decorations which show how the Ndebele paint their buildings. This is all new. This is a different kind of conception of what belongs in an art gallery. And these are very fascinating exhibitions, but I suppose the question is, what happens when you put into very much an art exhibition some of your new acquisitions of African craft objects? So here we have the basketware, and at the back you can see some of the ceramic bowls being exhibited alongside things which have absolutely no functional purpose whatsoever and are designed simply to be looked at. And this started to raise some questions about what's going on. Can these two things coexist in the same exhibitionary space? And it's a question that's still unresolved. Certainly, what strangely has happened here is that while this was designed exactly for this kind of institution and for this kind of treatment, these things weren't. They were designed primarily as objects that worked, or so they were originally anyway. And the other interesting question, and I'm going to be drawing to an end very soon, is, well, if you're going to expand your collection enormously and in an egalitarian spirit feel that any kind of lovingly crafted object really deserves serious attention, every bit as much attention as a painting, a sculpture, a work of art, where do you stop? And interesting debates raged in the 80s and 90s about this. Marilyn Martin, the director, felt that wire objects and little curios of beads and wire like these seen here, and we've all seen thousands of them at the sides of roads, were not art and didn't belong in the gallery. But that, at the same time as buying the work from somebody like Johannes Maswanganyi, we've just seen, which she felt did belong. And it was very hard sometimes to see what criteria were being applied. Why were some things being brought in and others not? One of the interesting issues that arises with the question of what can you reclassify as important enough to put into an art collection is the question of whether it is single or multiple. And I suppose one of the killer things for the curio market has always been that you see hundreds of them. They all look the same. But of course, you know, superb pieces of designed furniture are sometimes mass-produced too. So the question of mass production is definitely a difficult one, but it certainly doesn't seem to me that it should be decisive. At any rate, this is a really interesting discussion for an art collection to have. So this kind of thing gets left out, and many other things that we might feel are really significantly rather similar are brought in and have their status changed. They get reclassified as art. What about the art which gets left out of an art gallery? And I want to end by looking at a very controversial example of something which is very clearly art in the sense that the object's right. It's a painting, a whole series of paintings made for no other purpose than to be looked at. It has no function, but it has been rigorously excluded, this kind of work, from the gallery for many, many years, until just recently, in 2011, I think it was, there was a great big exhibition of this Russian South African artist's work at the gallery. The exhibition, as you will probably know, was enormously popular. Vast numbers of people came along to it, and why did they? Because they liked his work. So if a vast number of people like work like this, why has the gallery not collected it before? Well, the answer to that perhaps is because the gallery isn't in the business of collecting what most people like. And then you think, what? How can that be? Why should a gallery not be representing what most people like? And this brings me back to that issue that I really started with yesterday, which was one of the core issues that the art gallery deals with, is the question of good versus bad art, and the question of an art exhibition as not just providing simple pleasure, but uplifting, refining, improving its audience. Art galleries, art collections have always had the aim of showing work that is meant to make us in some way better educated in our taste as a result. And that generally means not showing what's popular, because that's easy. We already like that, we already know that, we already understand that, but showing what's difficult, collecting what's difficult. And the view of the art gallery over many decades was that Vladimir Tretyakhov's work was enormously popular because it was easy, in the sense that commercial adverts are easy and enjoyable, in the sense that light music is easy, in the sense that Barbara Cartland's novels are easy. But that's not good enough. That's not what an art gallery is for. An art gallery is meant to show you stuff that you find difficult and challenging. And in the view of a small number of art experts, that's a sign that it is good. There are other reasons, there are other things that you need apart from being difficult. But there is this idea that there's a small coterie of people who have a sense of a hierarchy of quality, and that is something very different from hitting the popular taste. But I think this exhibition raised a very interesting question. Countless directors had regarded Vladimir Tretyakov as absolute anathema. Matisse Bockhorst, for example, thought his work was dreadful. Raymond van Niekerk would have absolutely nothing to do with him. Marilyn Martin was approached to have an exhibition of his work, would have nothing to do with it. Suddenly, when the latest director, Riazan Naidu, took over, he thought, yes, let's do this, and let's call it the People's Painter, because he was interested in expanding the gallery to become a place of popular taste as well as of high art taste. And the interesting question, which I'll leave you with now, is this perhaps something that the gallery could do more of? And could it do it in a way that questions why such paintings, art after all, but paintings regarded by many people as not worthy art, could it do it in a way which questions how that hierarchy arises, why those views are had of somebody like Tretyakov? Could it do so in a way which looks, say, into the history of popular art generally, and make the exhibition space into something that is more of a discussion space about the way in which the art world works? In the conclusion of my book, I suggest that there are all sorts of ways in which exhibitions within art galleries could be much more discursive and much more open to discussion than they are at the moment. Because at the moment, when you see pictures on a wall, the tacit assumption is that these are great and you must find a way of enjoying them. And I think there's that sort of certainty that underlies the art exhibition could do with being questioned a bit more. But on that, I'll end and see if there are any questions. Yeah.
To what extent
Yeah, they do. Yeah, they do. Yes, and the annual reports over the years note those. It's very, very interesting, actually. So, for example, there's a great high point in the 1950s when those big historical loans come in. In the 1960s, too, when Bockhorst really makes the education department flourishing, that's a really good time, too. And then there are low points as well. Raymond van Niekerk, for example, bemoaned in the late 70s the fact that attendance figures were dropping, and that in his view it was perhaps partly to do with a move out to the suburbs from town, but also with the introduction of television to South Africa, which is so interesting. But yes, you can chart those attendance figures. And in the early days, occasionally, they would even do them racially, as you can imagine, so you can see what proportions there are. And it's not an inconsiderable percentage of people who are black and coloured. Yes.
The gallery is collecting
good art. Yes.
Where do they keep that? Do they have like vaults?
Yes. Yes. Piles of stuff is stored. Yes. The vast majority of it is in storage, and in fact, they've now had to take over one of the previous gallery rooms as a storage space because they're short of space and there are no funds to build anymore. They want to build an extra whole extension, but that idea's been mooted for ages and the funds never come. So yeah, you only see a fraction of it at most times. Taking up the whole room. Yes. Yeah, I mean, increasingly with installation art, you need to remove everything else, and it's space hungry. Yes.
You mentioned William Morris or the Bauhaus. Do you think this is the grey area between the two?
Yes. I didn't because of time, but yes. That chair, that Sussex chair I showed it, was made by William Morris's company, of course, and absolutely the Bauhaus is the art school which tries to, in the 20th century, put Morris's ideas of arts and crafts into practice. And it has, I mean, many of the Bauhaus people, once it was closed down by the Nazis, many of them emigrated to America, and they set up schools of art and design there. But it's interesting how in recent years that impetus again seems to have failed. There was a lot of good design work done in art schools in the 1960s, for example, but there's much less now. And the Michaelis School of Fine Art is appallingly narrow in its curriculum. I feel a bit treacherous for saying this as a member of the staff there, but I mean, I'm in the academic wing and I look on at what they're doing practically, and it's painting, sculpture, drawings and printmaking, and something they call new media, which is just using computers to design things. But no furniture making, no jewellery making, no fashion design, no theatre design, the Bauhaus ideals. And why not? Because they think it isn't important enough. And very interestingly, the tech does that sort of thing. Why? Because it's thought to be for less intelligent people. You don't need as much intelligence to produce objects like that. It's a weird hierarchy that we operate with. Yes?
I went to an exhibition in Johannesburg at Judea Park a couple of years ago, where they had art from all over Africa, but they had videos and interactive lighting and music and all sorts of ideas and concepts. And it was one of the most enjoyable exhibitions. I've been around so many where I've been bored silly.
Partly because of the absolute silence.
The way they present it.
Yes,
they're
yes.
They're dead.
Yes, yes.
This one was alive.
Yes,
And it was fun.
yes,
And I came out thinking, wow.
yes.
It was not what I expected.
And because it allowed you to do things and to interact as well, whereas normally you're so very passive, aren't you? Yes, yes, yes,
Lovely.
yes.
And we saw children doing it as well.
Yes.
My husband, no, he wasn't so keen. He didn't quite, sort of, the child in me came out.
Well, I do suggest at the end of my book that why don't we have comfortable chairs in gallery rooms? Have places where you can read about the works that are on show. Have a lot more by way of text to help you with the images that you're seeing. I mean, the assumption so often is that an image speaks for itself. We don't need anything more. But that comes from a very modernist assumption that the picture is quite separate from life and the ordinary concerns of life.
Do you not feel with the internet and everything, you actually need to become more relevant?
Yes, I think it's changing consciousness, yes, and museums are going to have to catch up, especially art museums, which still have this church-like kind of sanctity about them. Yeah, Nancy.
What impact, if any, did the merging of the South African National Gallery do when it became part of the Iziko collection? Did that impact negatively or positively?
Well,
Finances?
it impacted positively in the sense that it now has access to the other collections. So it borrows often from the collections of the old cultural history collections. But financially, I think it would be true to say it impacted negatively in that there's now more competition for scarce resources. And it impacted negatively too in that it now doesn't have a dedicated director. And that means that there isn't anybody who's got a specific vision for that kind of a collection. I mean, it seems to me that one very fruitful development that it could do would be to merge the old cultural history collections much more with the art gallery collections. But you've got to know what you're doing in order to work out how to explain the amalgamation and make interesting exhibitions out of that. And at present, the structure is that they have a director who oversees all of the Iziko museums. And actually, the current one for collections and exhibitions comes from the Natural History Museum, so he's a scientist. So that's the problem. Yeah. With the flooding, I'm afraid my guess is as good as yours. Goodness knows. It's, yep, yes. I mean, I'm not an employee of the gallery, and I have no sort of power over what goes on. But I just look on with dismay at how long that's taking, and Bertram House too. Yeah. But I suppose it's true to say that those are collections that aren't highly prioritised now because they're seen as part of the old South Africa. Yes?
The word that comes to mind in the context of Tretyakov broadening the popularity of exhibitions in museums is the word kitsch.
Yes.
Would you define that for us, and would you acknowledge that that is the danger of a people's painter becoming a sort of template for exhibitions?
Well, yeah, I mean, I didn't use the word kitsch, but he is often called the king of kitsch. And that's a sort of a German term which is meant to indicate sort of ersatz, bad quality, commercially popular work. And he, I suppose, is derided by so many people because he exhibited in department stores. He produced lavish numbers of reproductions of his work for cheap, popular purchase. His work is, well, I mean, I use the word easy, but it's bright and it's jolly and it's not pictorially challenging at all. So I think I can see why that concept of kitsch has got attached to him. But what I think it would be interesting would be for an art gallery to engage with concepts of kitsch. I mean, it might have an exhibition which asks, why do we call some things kitsch?